The Secret Beneath the Torn Mattress, asterisk. This was sent to us by Jared L. from New York, USA. If you'd like to share your own story, feel free to email it to us. Our email is in the video and channel description. I checked into an old hostel in Chicago late one evening, hoping to get some rest after a long day of sightseeing. The place was cheap and it seemed like a decent spot, but as soon as I walked into my room, something felt off. The room was small, barely enough space to move around. The walls were old, cracked in places, and the bed was basic, worn-out mattress, stained sheets, and a single dim light flickering above. But what caught my attention was the torn mattress. It wasn't just a small tear. The fabric was ripped open in a jagged line, exposing the foam inside. It looked like something had been shoved under the mattress. I tried to ignore it, but curiosity gnawed at me. That night, I woke up to a strange noise, something soft like scratching. It seemed to come from beneath the mattress. I figured it was just the old bed creaking, but it was too rhythmic, almost like something was alive. The noise continued for hours, but I couldn't bring myself to look. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked out a hostel and rushed to the front desk. As I was paying, I overheard the receptionist talking to someone else about room 304. Apparently, the room had been out of commission for a while after a strange incident involving the previous occupant. That's when I learned the truth. The previous guest had died there, alone, under mysterious circumstances. The police had never figured out what exactly happened. Some said it was suicide. Others said he was murdered by something or someone. I'll never forget the moment I realized that whatever was scratching under that mattress was probably him trying to get out. The end. The Echoing Footsteps. This was sent to us by Emily P. from Los Angeles, USA. If you'd like to share your own story, feel free to email it to us. Our email is in the video and channel description. It was my first night staying in a hostel in New Orleans. I was traveling solo, and the place seemed like a great deal old, historic, with that kind of vintage charm you expect from a city like New Orleans. I settled into my room, a small dorm with 4 beds, and the night started off normal. I was tired from the day's exploration, so I went straight to bed. The hostel was quiet, except for the faint sound of the wind outside and some distant street noise. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, echoing down the hallway. At first, I thought it was just another guest coming back from a late-night adventure, but the footsteps didn't stop at the door or fade away down the hallway like they should have. They stopped right outside my room. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore the feeling of dread crawling up my spine. The footsteps stayed there for what felt like an eternity, and then they turned around and walked back down the hall. It was too quiet. No creaking floors, no doors opening, just the sound of those heavy footsteps, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. When morning finally came, I asked the receptionist about it. She gave me a weird look and said, "You heard them, didn't you? Those footsteps never stop." Apparently, it was an old, long-abandoned wing of the hostel. Some guests had reported hearing those same footsteps at night, even though the wing hadn't been used in years. They say the footsteps belonged to a long-dead guest who died in the building. Asterisk, a man who wandered the halls searching for something that never came star. The end. The Whispering Walls, asterisk. This was sent to us by Brian M. from Texas, USA. If you'd like to share your own story, feel free to email it to us. Our email is in the video and channel description. I was staying in a hostel in Austin during a summer road trip. It wasn't the most luxurious place, but it was decent for the price. I checked in around midnight, and the place seemed eerily quiet. Too quiet for a hostel. There were a few other guests around, but it felt like I was the only one there. I was given a bed in a room shared with 2 other travelers. They were already asleep when I walked in, so I settled into my own bed and tried to sleep. The air was thick, and there was a strange, musty smell that didn't seem to go away. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft, whispering sound. At first, I thought it was one of the other guests talking in their sleep, but the whispers were too clear, too deliberate. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words, but it was like they were coming from the walls themselves. The whispers started to grow louder, and I began to feel a cold draft, even though the window was closed. The sound seemed to be surrounding me, coming from every direction. It wasn't just random noise. It sounded like someone was trying to communicate with me. I was frozen, unsure whether I should scream or leave the room. I finally gathered the courage to turn on the light and look around, but there was no one there, nothing out of the ordinary. The whisper stopped as soon as I flicked the light on, but I still felt a strange pressure in the room, like I wasn't alone. The next morning, I asked the receptionist if anything strange had happened in that room. She didn't hesitate and told me that room 207 had been reported to have whispers in the walls for years, especially at night. She said the hostel was built on an old property, and rumors swirled about past occupants who met strange, untimely ends. Apparently, some say the walls are alive, carrying the voices of the past, forever whispering, never quiet. The end. The Silent Knock. This was sent to us by Jessica W. from Florida, USA. If you'd like to share your own story, feel free to email it to us. Our email is in the video and channel description. It was my second night in a small hostel in Orlando, and the place was supposed to be a hidden gem. The location was perfect for tourists, and the reviews were decent. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That night, I stayed in a room on the top floor, one of the oldest parts of the building. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the building shifting. I tried to ignore the unease creeping over me and got into bed. Around 3:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a soft knock on my door. It wasn't loud or frantic, just a quiet tap, tap, tap. I figured it was one of my roommates, but when I checked the clock and realized they were both asleep in their beds, I was confused. The knocking continued, and it was getting louder. I couldn't ignore it anymore, so I got up, opened the door, and looked down the hallway. No one was there. The corridor was completely empty, and the lights were dim. I stepped out and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. But the knocking started again, this time from the wall near my bed. I rushed back into the room, heart racing. I stood there, staring at the wall, trying to process what was happening. The knocking persisted for what felt like an eternity, but just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The next morning, I asked the receptionist if anything unusual had ever happened in that room. She gave me a cold look and told me that room 405 had a long history of strange occurrences, including people hearing knocking or tapping on the walls at night. Some guests even claimed to hear whispers at times, though no one ever found out the source. Apparently, a woman had died in that room many years ago, under suspicious circumstances. They said she used to knock on the wall when she was upset, and even after her death, her presence still lingered, knocking in the silence of the night. The end. The Haunting in Room 206. This was sent to us by Matthew H. from Arizona, USA. If you'd like to share your own story, feel free to email it to us. Our email is in the video and channel description. I was on a solo backpacking trip through the South, and I found a small, budget-friendly hostel in Atlanta. It had a reputation for being cheap but clean and with a lot of history, which I thought added to its charm. After checking in, I was given a bed in room 206. The room was simple, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The air was heavy, and the temperature seemed to fluctuate unnaturally. I chalked it up to the old building, and the fact that I was probably just tired from the long day of travel. That night, I fell asleep quickly, but around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were speaking in hushed tones, like someone was right next to my ear, but there was no one there. I could hear fragments of words, none of them making sense. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and tried to locate the source of sound. The room was dark, but the whispers seemed to come from the corner near the window. I stood up to turn on the light, but before I could move, the whispers stopped, and then I heard something else, a soft scratching sound, like nails dragging across the floorboards. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure whether I should leave the room or stay. The fear of something unseen in the dark was suffocating. I eventually forced myself to turn on the light and looked around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The next morning, I asked the receptionist about the room, and her face instantly went pale. She told me that room 206 had been a problem for years. Multiple guests reported hearing whispers, scratching, and even feeling cold spots in the room. It turns out a previous tenant had died there in a strange accident, and her spirit never left. The hostel had never been able to get rid of her presence. The whispers, they said, were her last words. She had been trying to call out for help, but no one had ever answered. The end. The Midnight Visitor in room 112-inch asterisk. This was sent to us by David R. from California, USA. If you'd like to share your own story, feel free to email it to us. Our email is in the video and channel description. I was traveling across the country, doing a solo road trip, and decided to stop at a small hostel in San Francisco. It was late, and I had been driving for hours, so I just needed a place to crash for the night. The hostel had a vintage charm to it. Old wooden floors, antique furniture, and the smell of something both familiar and unsettling. I checked in around midnight, and the receptionist handed me a key to room 112, saying it was one of the more peaceful rooms. I didn't think much of it. I was just exhausted. When I got to the room, it was small, the bed creaky, and the room itself felt cold despite the heater running. There was a single dim light hanging from the ceiling, and the air was thick, almost as if the room itself had seen too much over the years. I tossed my bag onto the bed and collapsed, too tired to even think. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. At first, I thought it was the wind outside, but then I realized it was coming from the corner of the room, near the closet. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The tapping grew louder and more rhythmic, like someone was tapping their fingers on the wall. It didn't sound like anything natural. It was too deliberate, too consistent. I finally mustered the courage to get up, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned on the light, and the room was empty. The sound stopped immediately. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the mind and tried to go back to sleep. But as soon as I closed my eyes, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from the closet. I hesitated but couldn't ignore it. Slowly, I got up and walked over to the closet, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. As I opened the door, a sudden cold breeze hit me, and I felt a strange sensation, like something was watching me. The closet was empty, but there was a strange symbol scratched into the wall, something that looked like a cross with an X through it. It was old, worn, and etched into the wood as if it had been there for years. I backed away, my heart racing, and quickly shut the door. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, my mind racing with thoughts of what that symbol meant. I checked out early the next morning, too shaken to stay another minute. When I passed the front desk, I mentioned to the receptionist that something strange had happened in room 112. She didn't seem surprised at all. "Oh, you must have heard it," she said, as if it was a routine response. Room 112 has a history. People have been hearing that tapping for years. And the symbol in the closet? It's from an old guest who never left. They say he was looking for something and never found it. She paused for a moment, her eyes distant, and then added, "You're lucky." Some guests say they feel like they're being followed after staying in that room. I left the hostel, not knowing if I would ever return to San Francisco. But every time I think back to that night, I can still hear the sound of those deliberate taps. And I wonder if whatever was in that closet is still waiting for someone else to find it. The end.